Fake HOA officers slapped violation tags on Emma Carlisle's century-old landmark fence, demanding its removal in 48 hours. Behind the scheme stood Brad Kincaid, a developer's son who used fake enforcers to bully longtime residents. But Emma had one powerful ally, federal law protecting her family's historic fence. And just listen to how this stunning showdown unfolded, and why justice, in the end, prevailed. When Emma Carlisle bought the old farmhouse on Oak Ridge Lane, she imagined peace. Long afternoons in the garden, restoring faded history, and watching the sun set beyond the hand-built fence her great-grandfather had once raised. The white, split-rail fence had stood for over a century. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was a landmark, officially recognized, listed in the National Register of Historic Places, its craftsmanship and history preserved because it once marked a key junction along the old frontier trade routes. Emma was proud of that. She'd taught American history at the local university. Her own students often visited to see the last original trade fence in the county. But times had changed. The past year, a developer had rolled in with big promises and bigger construction crews. Shiny new homes had popped up across the once quiet road. With them came a brand new HOA board, hastily formed by buyers eager to enhance community aesthetics. Emma's property sat outside HOA boundaries, by law untouched by their rules. She paid no dues, signed no covenants. She'd even confirmed it with her lawyer before closing on the home. So, when the first letters arrived, Emma thought little of them. Subject, appearance guidelines, request for compliance. Goal, community cohesion. The tone was polite but persistent. Suggestions that the fence could be replaced with more uniform materials. Hints that her historic aesthetic was inconsistent with neighborhood values. Emma tossed them in a drawer. The fence wasn't going anywhere. But subtle notes turned to firmer warnings. Then they stopped altogether, until one crisp October morning. Emma opened her front door, coffee in hand, and froze. Two men in dark navy polos stood by her fence, one near the front post, the other pacing along the rails. Their shirts read Community Compliance Patrol, a name Emma had never heard. One man knelt, affixing a large fluorescent orange tag. The other zip-tied a bold sign to her main fence post, Non-Compliant Fencing. Removal ordered within 48 hours. Failure to comply may result in fines and enforcement action. Emma's heart pounded. Fines? Enforcement? They had no authority here. She strode outside. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" One man glanced at her, unbothered. "Ma'am, per HOA Ordinance Revision 22B, this structure is in violation. We're posting notice." Emma's voice sharpened. "My property is not part of the HOA, and this fence is a federally protected landmark." The second man, tall, lean, pulled a small badge from his belt and flashed it quickly. It looked more like a novelty item than official ID. "We're authorized under community enforcement guidelines," he said curtly. Emma narrowed her eyes. "Your guidelines don't apply here. Give me your names, now." Neither answered. Without another word, they gathered their tools and walked briskly to a waiting SUV. Within moments, they were gone, leaving behind the garish signs and a thudding weight in Emma's chest. She stood by the fence for a long time, breath shallow. Then, something shifted inside her. A familiar spark. The same instinct that had driven her through years of archival research and courtroom preservation battles. Emma went inside, pulled out her files, her property deed, the federal landmark certification, the National Register documentation, and then she opened her laptop and began documenting every detail. Because one thing was certain, something here was very, very wrong. It didn't take long for Emma to trace the source of the attack. A few discreet conversations with longtime neighbors painted a disturbing picture. The new HOA president, Brad Kincaid, wasn't just any board member. He was the son of the very developer who had transformed the old road into a suburban showcase. And he had plans. Brad had been overheard in meetings, some of them recorded and quietly shared, speaking of branding the neighborhood and presenting a cohesive image. He viewed older properties as blemishes, relics he intended to erase. Emma's fence, so treasured by historians and visitors, was to him an eyesore. He said it outright, one neighbor whispered over coffee, told the board he'd get rid of that fence one way or another, said it ruins the photos. The deeper Emma dug, the uglier the truth became. The so-called Community Compliance Patrol wasn't an official department. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't even a licensed security firm. Brad had recruited a handful of contract workers through a local job board, hired for cash, and given matching polos and fake badges. No credentials, no authority, no training. Emma's lawyer friend, Claire, confirmed it over a tense phone call. Their entire claim is baseless. The HOA's authority stops well short of your property line, and that fence, it's protected under federal law. They so much as scratch it. They're in violation of the National Historic Preservation Act. Emma gripped the phone tighter. Then why the bold sign? Why the threats? Claire's voice was calm but firm. They're counting on intimidation. It's worked before. And it had. Emma learned that two elderly couples, both original landowners like herself, had been similarly targeted. After weeks of pressure and escalating compliance notices, they had sold and moved out. In one case, a beloved, century-old barn had been tagged, declared unsafe, and bulldozed within days, its loss quietly mourned by the town's historical society. Emma's fury boiled. Her great-grandfather's fence wasn't just lumber. It was family. It was history. And now it stood in the crosshairs of an opportunist who cared more about glossy marketing photos than the community's soul. Brad was hoping she'd cave, that she'd grow weary of the fight, just as the others had. But Emma wasn't built that way. She cleared a space on her dining table and began assembling an arsenal. Original landmark registration forms, her property survey clearly marking the boundary outside HOA control, scanned copies of the National Register documents, federal preservation statutes. She photographed the fake violation tags, recorded video of the posted sign, and documented everything the so-called patrol had done. And then, after a deep breath, she began making calls. First to the State Historical Commission, then to the National Park Service, which oversaw the federal landmark registry, and finally to a well-regarded journalist known for covering HOA abuses. Because if Brad Kincaid wanted a public battle, Emma Carlisle was ready to give him one. By the time dawn broke on the 48th hour, Emma Carlisle was ready. She hadn't slept much, not for lack of trying. The hours had been spent organizing files, answering questions from the state preservation officer, and confirming every legal detail with her lawyer. Her phone buzzed just after 6 a.m. A neighbor had spotted them, a flatbed truck turning onto Oak Ridge Lane. 3 men in orange vests rode in the back, a crew with chainsaws. One of them had a bolt cutter dangling from his belt. They were coming for the fence. Emma stood by her window and breathed through her anger. She had already made the most important calls. Now it was about being patient and letting the law speak louder than any voice she could raise herself. Moments later, the first surprise arrived. 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled in from the opposite direction, parking quietly along the street. Men and women in plain dark jackets stepped out, badges ready, the Federal Historic Preservation Enforcement Team from the National Park Service. Beside them stood a State Historical Commission officer, carrying a thick folder under his arm. The local sheriff arrived minutes later. Emma had spoken with him personally the day before. He parked his cruiser with lights flashing, a visible signal that this would not be a routine HOA action. Emma stepped outside just as the crew was unloading equipment. The sheriff approached them first. "Stop where you are. This is now an active federal investigation." Confused, the workers looked around. Cameras from local news outlets, tipped off by Emma's journalist contact, were already rolling across the street. The so-called Community Compliance Patrol had returned too, the same 2 men from days before. This time their faces were pale. The sheriff motioned for them to step aside. "Let's see those badges," one of the federal agents said firmly. What followed wasn't loud, but it was devastating. The men reluctantly produced their flimsy ID cards. The agent examined them, then glanced toward the sheriff. "These are not valid law enforcement credentials," the agent stated calmly. "Possession and display of these for the purpose of intimidation may be subject to criminal charges." At that moment, a familiar whirring sound approached. Brad Kincaid pulled up in a gleaming golf cart, phone in hand, smile wide, as if ready to gloat over a small victory. That smile evaporated the second he took in the scene. Federal agents, cameras, the sheriff, and Emma standing tall by her fence. He stepped out stiffly. "What's going on here?" he asked, attempting to sound in control. A federal agent approached him, handing over an official cease and desist order. His voice was level and clear enough for the surrounding microphones to catch. "You are hereby ordered to cease any and all actions related to the tampering or removal of this federally registered landmark. Tampering carries both civil penalties and potential criminal liability under federal law." Emma watched from a few feet away, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from sheer resolve and controlled fury. This wasn't just about her fence anymore. It was about what had been done to her neighbors, to the history of the land, to every person who had been bullied by this man's ambition. But it wasn't over yet. The agents turned to Emma. "Ma'am, we'd like you to provide us with everything you've documented, the badges, any correspondence, video evidence." Emma nodded, her voice steady. "I have it all prepared." Inside her home, she laid out her meticulous records, photos of the violation tags, video of the intimidation, copies of the letters, and emails from the HOA. The agents reviewed every page carefully. When Emma and the agents returned outside, the sheriff pulled her aside and spoke quietly. "They'll be pressing charges," he said, "and I'd prepare for a federal suit. You've done the right thing." Emma exhaled, the first breath that felt real in days. As cameras continued to capture the moment, Brad Kincaid was escorted towards one of the unmarked SUVs for further questioning. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a strained expression that spoke volumes. Emma stood by the fence as the sun rose higher. The fight was no longer just hers. It was now on the record, and the law was on her side. The fallout came faster than anyone had predicted. Within days, the federal investigation confirmed the entire scheme. Brad Kincaid had knowingly hired unlicensed contractors to impersonate enforcement officers. The Community Compliance Patrol had no legal standing. Their fake badges and threatening notices violated multiple statutes, both state and federal. The media seized on the story. It had all the makings of a headline. "Developer's son faces federal charges for tampering with historic landmark." Reporters flocked to Oak Ridge Lane. Footage of the scene, Brad's smirk vanishing, federal agents on site, aired across regional news. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Under mounting legal pressure and facing the prospect of further exposure, the HOA board unraveled. One by one, members resigned. The board dissolved within weeks, unable to withstand the combined force of lawsuits and public scrutiny. But the reckoning didn't stop there. Inspired by Emma's stand, several longtime residents, including the two couples who had previously been pressured to leave, joined forces with local attorneys. A class action suit was filed against the former board members and the developer's company for harassment, intimidation, and property loss. And as for Emma, her fence now stood prouder than ever. At the recommendation of the State Historical Commission, a new bronze plaque was installed on the main post, clearly visible to all who passed: Protected National Historic. Landmark tampering prohibited by federal law. Word spread quickly. Soon, small groups of visitors began to stop by. Students, history enthusiasts, even passing tourists, snapping photos and asking Emma about the fence's story. Emma welcomed them warmly. The fence had once been a quiet piece of her family's past. Now it had become a symbol of standing firm against those who sought to erase it. At the next town meeting, Emma stood before a packed room. She kept her words simple. "I'm not against progress," she said. "I'm not against community improvement. But history is not an eyesore. It's who we are, and it deserves to be honored, not bulldozed." The room erupted in applause. Neighbors rose to their feet. Even town officials, some of whom had once been indifferent to the HOA's overreach, now voiced their support for greater protections on historic properties. Meanwhile, as Brad's legal team worked behind the scenes to negotiate plea deals and avoid trial, Emma found a quiet peace returning to her home. One crisp morning, as sunlight caught the bronze plaque, Emma stood on her porch with a cup of coffee in hand. She gazed out at the old white split-rail fence, her great-grandfather's legacy, and smiled softly. Justice had been served, and this time history had won.